Hi, welcome to week 3. Today I'm going to go over with you some issues about argument analysis. And I'm sorry, this was supposed to load yesterday and I was having some problems with it, so hopefully it's fixed now. So what I want to talk a little bit about is both of the essays and sort of our focus for the prompt, and then kind of some strategies for argument, and introduce the idea of concession. So just as a reminder of the essay prompt, first of all, you're going to analyze the arguments for and against reparations for slavery of Africans in the U.S. How you're going to do that though, is you're going to be evaluating the arguments that Coates and Williamson make in their articles. Coates' article was written first. It was considered pretty thorough sort of case for reparations, and kind of gained a lot of attention when it was published. Williamson wrote a response, and so his approach is kind of counter-argument. He's showing why there's weaknesses to Coates' argument rather than coming up with his own arguments. So you're going to take into consideration both of their techniques that they use and the content of what they have to say, and then you ultimately, in the conclusion, you're going to say whether you're for or against reparations for slavery. And then sort of how much, you will talk about how much the arguments influenced your decision. So most of the essay is just going to be an analysis of how they make their arguments and kind of the pros and cons, what's weak, what's strong, what's effective, what's ineffective, and then the conclusion you kind of give your view on the topic. Okay? So, before we do that, I'll be giving examples as we go through this about different things that are in that, the case for reparations and the case against reparations, and the techniques that are being used, okay? So I want to introduce Toulmin's model of argument. You may have heard this before, but I just want to make sure. He was this philosopher that came up with this more friendly version of argument versus using syllogisms that were typical before like the 50s. There's 6 steps. Typically, 4 of them are kind of really important, 3 or 4 of them, but they're all good to know because they're different techniques that you can use. So the 6 steps, or they're not necessarily done in order, but the 6 parts is the claim, which could be the main thesis. You are for reparations or against reparations, and why. But there could be like subclaims, right? That reparations are necessary because of discrimination in housing, right? That could be a subclaim. Then the grounds or the reasons or supported evidence that bolster the claim. What is the evidence that you can provide to show? So sometimes the evidence are history or numbers, statistics, but it can also be examples or stories. The warrant is the principal provision or chain of reasoning that connects the grounds to reason to claim. This is often unstated, and we'll get to this in a minute, but I think the warrant that Williamson has is different than Coates, and so I want you guys to see the differences there. We'll get to that in a minute. Backing is what kinds of justifications you use to kind of support that warrant. Rebuttal, definitely Williamson uses rebuttal. He gives exceptions to the claim, counterexamples. He talks about other groups who've been harmed. And then qualifications. Are there any limits or scopes to this? Coates gives some of that in the video where he says, look, I'm not saying exactly how it should look. I could do that, but that's another essay. He's not giving solutions in his essay, but just the reasonings that it should happen. So let's first start with the claim. It's normally there's 3 types of claims or thesis. One's policy, fact, or value. A policy claim normally has a should or ought, and that's kind of what we're doing with this one. Police brutality here should not be decided by local prosecutors. You might say something like reparations should be given because, right? Another kind of claim is value. It's when you use some comparison that something is better or worse or more or less effective than the other. You could say something like, for our case, something like reparations are more necessary here than even in the case of Native Americans because, and give a reason why, if it's necessary for Native Americans, shouldn't it be even more necessary for African Americans? Fact, X equals Y. This is Normally you'll always hear teachers say like a thesis is not a fact, which is true. But sometimes a thesis is stated so assertively that it sounds like a fact. So you, if you say something is something, as long as it could be countered, someone could have an opposite view, that can still be a claim. But they state it so assertively that it sounds like a fact. So your claims have to be clear and convincing. Why you think Williamson is maybe more effective in some ways than Coates, or why Coates is more effective than Williamson in other ways. And it needs to have some detail. So there's three examples here that add more detail so that it is very clear. So men and women should have equal rights. Well, that's huge and broad and not necessarily focused. The second one focuses on legal rights, and then equal rights for men and women should be protected by our Constitution. You see how that claim all of a sudden becomes one of policy and has the should statement in it. Grounds, evidence that supports, normally examples, testimony, or statistics. For this one, looking at past history is important because you get a sense of people's stories and what happened to them, and that can raise the emotional response, but it can also be factual. It's something that happened to this person plus many others. So testimonies are good in this situation. The warrant is the unstated feeling or moral view behind it. So I give an example here about needle exchange programs. These are programs for people who are heroin users, and they tend to, if they use needles that are dirty, they can spread HIV or do harm to other people. And so needle exchange programs let them turn in their needles for clean ones. Some people say, well, that promotes drug use, therefore we shouldn't do it. But other people say, well, they're going to do it anyway, so we should give them clean ones to keep them safe and keep them from death. So that's the idea of the warrant, like what's the value behind it. So some people may have a value on this situation with case of reparations that there is a moral imperative to do something here, where other people may not feel that there is a moral imperative. Okay. So the types of backing, you can show weaknesses or strengths in arguments by how large the pool of subjects were for like a study, by the credibility of someone, by something that they omitted, by this evidence is more recent. If they use some logical fallacies, these are lapses in logic, then where they're attacking people, or instead of the argument, or they're saying it has to be this or this, rather than saying it could be neither or both. Those are all logical fallacies. There's many of those, and we want to avoid those but point them out in our opposition. So counter-argument, there's three types. Concession that's strategically given, that doesn't give up your whole view, but like shows that you understand the opposition and you point that out. Williamson does this in his essay. He says, this is what Coates does for us. He does these good things, and he's right about these things. But then he also refutes. So he creates his counter-argument about the way in which Coates does this and the premise. So he says he does a lot of good work, but he doesn't build a case. That's his criticism. And then the demonstration of irrelevance. Is there anything that the opposition gives that's irrelevant? Concession obviously means to give away, like a concession stand. You kind of go to get food or get something. To concede is to give up. And so one of the things about it that can be helpful is it helps your audience know that you are sort of thinking about their view. It kind of opens them up to you. And you can use this dependent clause structure, which I think would be really helpful. So if you look at this sentence, while Williamson's concessions may open skeptical readers' minds to his point of view, comma, that's the dependent clause part, that's where you concede. Then you make your main point. Ultimately, he presents comparisons and examples that undermine his criticism of Coates' The Case for Reparations. If this were my thesis, which is a fine thesis, I would then kind of show, like, I would start with Williamson and show like what he does, and then I would critique it and say he's not effective. I would also then have to bring in Coates and kind of talk about Coates' arguments and his response to those. So some common transition phrases that you can use and think about these. The first column is like your concession word, like it's true that Williamson brings up these points regarding reparations and the difficulty in determining them or how they bring up. However, he ignores this point. Therefore, this is weaker or stronger than the other. So all of the words in the first column are kind of concession words, contrast words in the middle, and result words at the end. And you can mix them up if you want, but those are kind of a nice guide to remember and to use when you're writing this. Okay, so what you're going to be doing here is I'm going to ask you to write a thesis statement and share it. Okay, so we don't have the whole thing planned out yet, but you're just going to share this thesis statement. Try to write it in a dependent clause structure if you can. If you can't, that's okay. And try to see, as you're grappling with these two essays, I know they're long and they're complicated, but see what you can do as far as getting a thesis statement together. Hopefully the examples I've given you here and the ideas here will help. Post that in the online discussion. We'll give you feedback and give each other feedback, and then we'll add on an outline and a plan. Okay? If you have other questions, please let me know. I'm here and happy to help. Thanks.